Hello and welcome to Books Up Close, the podcast. I'm Chris Lloyd, a writer and academic, and on this show I talk to other writers about their work and their practice. We also collaborate on a close reading of their writing, looking at a particular passage or a whole poem, and talk about its meanings, resonances, and the technicalities of language. This is a show for book nerds, aspiring and established authors, or anyone interested in how texts get made. In this episode, I talked to Andrew McMillan about his novel Pity, newly out in paperback. Andrew is the author of 3 collections of poetry and 1 novel. He lives in Manchester. Well, thank you, Andrew, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Amazing. So, before we get into the actual extract from Pity, I want to ask what your thoughts generally are on close reading as like a practice and an endeavour. How do you feel about close reading, your work with me also today?
Right, so here's the thing. Give me your definition of close reading.
Okay, we're turning it back on me. Fine. So my definition of close reading really is the close attention to textual detail, right? So that's reading the text in depth. It's paying attention to the words, the grammar, the structure, the form, before we start pulling in any kind of context or broader issues. That doesn't mean we never pull in context, right? But it means we start with what's on the page first, and that's what I want to kind of do in this discussion.
I think it's a really interesting kind of endeavour, to use your word. And I think it's something that's really kind of useful for, particularly for literary critics. I think that it's important as writers as well, like in that sense of reading as a writer. I think the danger is, as a practice, that to a certain extent, it's a very separate thing from kind of pure creativity. And which is why I think to hold both is really difficult, right? You know, because oftentimes, say, like even with students, if we're doing things that are creative and critical kind of elements together within a unit, the danger is that you spend time doing that really close textual analysis of the structure of the line break, the enjambment of a poem, for example, but then you sit down with a blank piece of paper in the afternoon and have to write, but without any of that stuff in your head. And I often think it's also why, you know, fundamentally to reading is really the way to learn to be a writer, but you also have to be able to put all that aside, because there's an element of very good writing that is purely instinctual and is oftentimes less polished because it's more instinctive than something that one might kind of perform that kind of close reading on, which is why I think oftentimes the very best literary critics aren't the best writers. There are exceptions to that rule that we could all think of, like Ian Hamilton as a poet, I think is extraordinary, or very few poems in his life, but also a really interesting critic. But it's oftentimes the two don't necessarily sit exceedingly close together, I don't think, in that sometimes people can't get out of their own heads, I think, because they what essentially you end up with is people wanting to close read their own work before they've written it. So they go, well, if I say this, if this character does this, if this image is in it, then a critic would be able to find this in it, or this is the nuanced meaning. And that's just kind of the enemy of writing, right? That's the enemy of creativity. So I guess it's something I enjoy doing, and it's something that I think is really important. It's just something that isn't an easy bedfellow of creativity, I don't think. What do you think?
No, that's definitely why I'm interested in doing this show, I think, is to kind of bring what we do in literature classrooms, right, which is like pull apart a text, and I'm interested in doing that with the person that wrote it, just to see what happens. Like, I'm interested in maybe me seeing things in the text that you have no thought about or no insight into, or collaborating on a reading of your text in a way that's kind of outside of you. And I'm also interested in what possible conversations can come up. Like, I could easily do this where we read your book and I read it with someone else, right? But actually I'm wondering what our dialogue about your work adds to the discussion, and whether we can learn anything from that, either as writers or critics. My other question before we go into this is, you've written poetry up to this point, right? And some non-fiction essays. So how did you find the transition from poetry writing to prose writing, or at least or novel writing, I guess?
I think in some ways it's just a very different part of the brain. I read a lot more fiction probably than I read poetry, maybe. I, in the first instance, wanted to see if I could do it. as a kind of challenge to myself, as a kind of competitive sense with the self of, could I extend words that far? I mean, Pit is only, calling it a novel is very generous, isn't it? It's 32,000 words. It's really a novella. And that's kind of my limit. Like, that was me hitting a wall. Like, I couldn't do any more than that. But there's something about poetry that, until you're doing the deep work of editing, of kind of trying to really fight with each line and word, which is what I'm kind of doing at the minute with the new collection, until you're doing that, it can exist very much in the kind of margins of a life. So it can, you could write a couple of lines on the tram on the way to work. You can, or actually also, I think as you get more experienced in poetry, you can write much more in your own head, and you can carry drafts around for a long time, so that by the time you come to draft something, the kind of first draft has already been written. I think to a certain extent that's kind of impossible with prose, or I don't have that kind of brain. And so the main difference, I think, is just the way that you have to live with it. The very obvious thing that you have to do it every day, which I hadn't realised. So I spent years trying to write a novel every so often in the way that you do with poems, and that obviously doesn't work. So just the kind of deep time of every day of it, I think. But also, it's the kind of structural architecture of it that is so much bigger. So with a poem, you get to a stage where you work out how to enter it, how to leave it. If it's not working, it either just gets put to one side for years and you can come back to it if you want, or you notice that image. That image doesn't make sense because those other images, that line isn't quite working, the scansion's off in that phrase. And it's kind of like, so editing a poem becomes like keyhole surgery in that way. You can kind of go, oh, it's that bit that's not working. And then you hope by extracting that, you kind of don't kill the whole of it. But with fiction, with narrative, it's the entire architecture of time that's different. And so the edits to a novel are like, oh, the entire perspective of this entire character is wrong, or, well, the entire nature of time in this whole thing doesn't work. And so the constant, I think, dismantling and rebuilding of that is what I think is fascinating. Structurally, kind of, the structure of it is just larger, I guess. But the structural stuff is what's actually really interesting in prose, I think, because, like, plot's really easy. Like, anyone can come up with a plot, right? Like, well, this happens and this happens. And the kind of only thing that's really on the line in prose fiction is, well, how do you tell it? What's the structure of it? What's the kind of delivery mechanism of that story? And those things I find really interesting. They just take a lot longer than they do in poetry. They take years to kind of wrestle with and redo and rewrite it. And so you also just have to have a kind of patience with yourself, not with the work, but somehow with the self, to sit with yourself that long, right? Yeah, trying to, that constant demolition, rebuild of it, until you end up with something that you feel vaguely is moving towards what you wanted it to be, I think.
That's interesting. So we're going to talk about an early part of the book, which you're going to read for us in a minute. Is there anything, if listeners haven't read it yet, is there anything they need to know about it? I guess they don't, because it's like it's chapter 2 or the second section, the second fragment. Is there any pre-knowledge they need?
Not really, other than we're like in a village just outside Barnsley. This is a section that I think as we go along is kind of like becomes understood is kind of taking place in the past. So it's taking place in the kind of 60s or 70s, I guess. But yeah, I think that's all we need, really.
Okay, great, thanks.
He steps out into the long corridor of early dawn, the street stretching downwards, pointing him to where he's headed. It's Monday, when the weekend is still unshaven stubble in his mind. Above, the sky is a solid lump of cloud, and 3 doors down, Pat is just closing his front door. Another few doors on, there'll be Harry and then Frank, and as they all turn the corner together, Skip will already be ahead of them, and each of them will briefly consider running after him, and then think better of it. Nobody speaks. They incline their heads as someone else joins them and then keep on walking. More and more men fall out of their houses like dominoes, their faces not yet blackened. Someone whistles, someone else coughs. Occasionally some stop and lean for a moment on the low wall of a garden, pretending they need to double-check their snap tin or enjoy a long drag on their roll-up, sputtering the smoke out into the cold air in shallow breaths. Nobody waits for them. They just keep on walking. The village on their shoulder now, still asleep, not watching the migration of tired bodies. One of the men once said he thought he could hear the coal ticking. Another man told him to stop talking daft. And beneath their feet, a mile down, history, waiting to be hacked into chunks and pulled out.
Great, thank you so much for reading that. It's always nice to hear the author reading it, I think, and the intone and the inflections and all those kind of things. So I chose this, I think, because it feels quite different in tone and style from the first part of the novel where we kind of meet the younger men. It's definitely quite different stylistically, and I thought there was something going on here, especially about thinking about the past and who these historical people are kind of impinging on the present of the novel. But also you do something here about the men, right? And it's like he steps out. We're already in a world where we don't quite know who this he is. However, he's also wrapped up with these other men, right? The kind of repetition of them going together. So there's something about repetition and circularity here that I'm interested in, the kind of abstract nature of it. So I kind of want to work through it sentence by sentence, this extract, and kind of point out what I see and hear what you think about those things. Like the he steps. I want to talk about the present tense in this novel. I don't know if you've heard one of the recent Zadie Smith interviews where she kind of railed against present tense narratives taking off these days. That's in quote marks. I think she's very wrong. I think she's very wrong about a number of things, but we won't get into that today. And she basically says that this immediacy of the present tense is like a fake immediacy. But I also think that another novelist might have put the past sections right in the past tense, not in the present tense. And I'm wondering about how that present tense, even to describe stuff that's happening before the present day of the novel exists, kind of not flattens history, but makes all of this, I don't know, in the same moment, if you like, that the past and the present are on the same kind of continuum.
Yeah, I suppose maybe it should have been in past tense. Maybe that would have made more sense. It's too late now, but I think maybe for the next one. But I think there is something, I guess, in what you're saying about, I mean, the whole underpinning of the book in some ways is about the haunting of the past and the present, right? It's all the kind of Avery Gordon social haunting stuff. So I think there is something about the kind of flattening of it, I guess, to a certain extent. The idea that to a certain extent, it's a flashback because it's told in fragments, just kind of like these moments that are in the past. Like it's not, I guess it's not a character going, oh, he did this, he walked that. It's this kind of like odd, omniscient kind of voice that holds it together, I guess. That is, whilst this moment's in the past, we're seeing it in the present. We're seeing it in the moment as it happens, which I think is necessary in order for the kind of crescendo of what happens within that timeline. It has to feel immediate in order for that, I think, to potentially have impact. Rather than just being a historical thing, you kind of have to be there in the moment of it. I guess it is because, as you say, it's not a flashback. It's we're in the present moment, but a present moment that happened kind of 50 years ago. I mean, to a certain extent, like the idea of it being a false idea of immediacy. It's a novel, it's made up, it's all false. None of it's true.
Yeah, I'm also interested in this part, especially the kind of, you really lean on metaphor more than some of the other parts. I feel like in rereading it anyway, like he steps out in the long corridor of dawn, is the quote. Straight away we're in this more literary language, if you like, than some of the other sections, or at least figurative language, I should say. Maybe not literary, but figurative language, which again is interesting kind of in thinking about the kind of dailiness, the ordinariness of these men's lives, right? Which could easily be written, again, in a very different kind of tone and style. It could easily be something more stripped back and plain because of the plainness of the men's lives or whatever. I can imagine a different historical novel doing that, where straight away you give us the long corridor, then a semicolon, the street stretching downwards, or that sibilance pointing him to where he's headed, the street pointing him, right? Like the street already has some kind of agency, like the landscape has some kind of power in this scene. The men are just moving along. It's Monday. So again, that really grounding us in the present moment. It's Monday and the weekend is still unshaven, stubble in his mind, another metaphor. Two in those first two sentences. How much are you thinking, like, is that too many metaphors in like a short space of time? These feel like metaphors that might appear in your poems to me anyway.
These are certainly the more poetic bits of it. They're the more lyric bits of it. I mean, the thing about the landscape is, in those kind of places, so in the village that this is set, but also in places in the northeast, you have, and this is the difference between like the industrial landscapes of these kind of places compared to, say, the northwest, which is much more mill. So you have like the canals, you have mill buildings. You have in kind of mining something that was obviously underground, so is invisible apart from kind of slag heaps and the odd undulations of kind of the grassed over slag heaps and things like that. But also oftentimes kind of architectures of villages that are built around an absence. So the most obvious one that I've ever been to is Horden in the northeast, which is famous for having these numbered streets. The streets don't have names, they have numbers. The entire kind of architecture of that village almost feels as though it comes around towards this just that void where the kind of pit was. So in that sense, it does have agency. I mean, these are, as you say, I guess, back to the other point, the kind of most lyric parts of it. There was a challenge, I think, in thinking about how nostalgia operates in places like Barnsley, to think about the common misconception, or the thing that people get wrong about places like Barnsley, I think, amongst many other things, is that there isn't a nostalgia or a yearning for the job itself, because nobody in their right mind would want their own kid to go down the pit. Like, it's not a thing that you'd want for anybody, because it's brutal work. But there's nostalgia or a kind of longing potentially for what it was felt that job brought somewhere, which is like enough money to raise a family on, stable jobs, etc., etc. And we don't have to go into all the economics of that. But the challenge, I guess, to me was, could you write about something that I think stereotypically might be written about quite harshly or quite unpleasantly? Could you write about it really beautifully, i.e. lyrically, I guess, metaphorically, without romanticizing it and without kind of looking at it through rose-tinted glasses? So could you apply a kind of lyric language to it, an imagistic language, a metaphor to it? Yeah, without kind of sanitizing it, I guess. And I was just interested, I guess, in that as a dilemma, whether that was possible to do, which is why these moments also are quite dreamlike, I guess, just have that slight other quality to them, I think.
Yeah, the next line, the sky is a solid lump of cloud. You've got so much of that figurative language pulling through that I think after the first fragment of the book, which is very bodily, it's quite frank, it's quite explicit sexually, and it's very different tonally. And I think there's interesting, like the movements between these different sections in the novel are sometimes jarring, and maybe intentionally so that we're kind of jumping around in perspective. It's more a kind of collage, right? As a formal move rather than developmental. It's more kind of moving around.
Yeah, and it seemed like, I don't know, like that genuinely wasn't like a deliberate thing. Like it was just how it ended up coming out. But it is something that you have to like, and I only realized this after it came out, right? Because then it's kind of in the world and people talk about it. Is you either stick with that or you don't, which is kind of fine, right? So, but you either give up after 20 pages because it just makes no sense, or you persevere and hopefully it kind of gets tied together later on. And what's been interesting is we've got a brilliant audiobook edition of it. I think probably it's harder in the audiobook, or that I have heard discussion of, because you don't have the like the markers of italics or even just like the page turn to signify that. So I know a couple of people that have struggled with the structured kind of oral in that sense, like as they've been listening to it.
The interesting bit to me is then like Pat is closing his door another few doors down. There will be Harry and Frank as they all turn the corner together. Like there will be the inevitability, the regularity, the way in which this could be any Monday in any year of their working lives, right? And I think that those linguistic little moments of nobody speaks, they incline their heads, more and more men fall out of their houses, the way in which the regularity, the circularity is kind of built into the way you're writing, not just the content of what you're writing. And I think that's something that I think is important to point out.
I remember when I drafted this, I'd knocked it back and forth with my agent, and then we'd sold it. And then the first editorial meeting I had, they just went like, right, what is the narrative present of this novel? And I had no idea what that meant. No one had ever asked me that before. Because poetry doesn't have a narrative present. So poetry exists, or my poetry exists, in like the glimpse. So poetry has I have no interest in what happened before or after the poem. It's the poem. So it's just a glimpse of something. It doesn't have time in the same way. And when this had sold and we were kind of looking at it on like spread out on the table, I remember this conversation with my editor where it was like, well, that section seems like it takes a month, but that seems like it lasts a year, and that seems like it takes a day. So what on earth where is time in this? And it seems ridiculous now, but it never occurred to me that that's how fiction operates and that's what's different to poetry. And so also that repetition becomes a way of just marking time. Going, well, if it's a week, then each morning as they come out of their house, you can just use that to reset the clock or to kind of mark that shift. And so it serves that very kind of literal, structural role as well, I think, within it.
Yeah, that's helpful to think about. The more and more men fall out of their houses like dominoes, their faces not yet blackened. Again, the thing that will inevitably happen again and again. And I think there's something about the idea of work, right? I feel that there's more of a glut these days of good novels about work, about the processes of work, about its repetitiveness. I could like list a run of books, I think, especially, millennial novels about working in offices or the kind of grunt of those temp jobs. Like all of the commas as well as the semicolons, and you get repetition, you get listing. All of this stuff really helps emphasize that we're going back again, we're going back into the mind. And that really pulls us into the world in a particular way. Quote, then someone whistles, someone else coughs. It made me think of something actually I did when I was like 5. I don't know what age I am. We had to write these stories in school. Maybe I'm older than that. And I think I would always go to the abstract, never the particular. So I'd be like, oh, people are walking down the corridor. And my teacher would always write, who's walking? I'd be like, the kids are eating crisps. And she would write, which children, what crisps? As though, like, specificity. But here, actually, the point is that they're all together, right? They're all en masse, if you like. Like, all of the men are in this as one group. And actually, the individuality is not part of the point. It's actually that they're all... Anybody could be whistling. And I like that idea that we've started out with an unnamed he at the beginning of the extract, and we're still in the world of the abstract rather than the particular, even though their experience is particular.
Yeah, I think so. I wonder why, though. I mean, that's not bad advice from your primary school teacher. But there's something about just like the soundscape of it, I guess, or it's the texture of something, really, right? The kind of texture of the moment. Yeah, someone whistles, someone else coughs. Also, I mean, what I was really interested in these sections was like, but how do you talk about just the physical degradation of bodies, of that labour on people, without kind of being really obvious about that? So the cough or the shallow breath that comes later on, the drag on the rope, this kind of pausing oftentimes, like they have to stop as they walk and things like that, like paying attention to the physical impact that being on the coalface certainly had on people, had on their lungs.
Yeah, and you get that texture also through the sound, right? Like sputtering the smoke in shallow breaths, the kind of softness of that sibilance running through it. And then in the last paragraph, one of the men once said he thought he could hear the coal ticking. Another man told him to stop talking daft. That's kind of what we'd call indirect discourse, right? Where you're hearing that other man's voice in an abstract way. It's not got quote marks around it. And it stopped talking daft. That word daft is the word that gives away vocality to me, the particular vernacular, if you like.
I hope so. And I think the dilemma of this kind of writing, right, or regionally situated writing, is whether you write it in vernacular or not. I think the argument against that in Pity was that for an accent that's already kind of seen as comedic or seen as has less social status than others, that what you don't want is people doing the imitation of it in their own head. And it's very, very difficult to write it without stereotyping it, because a lot of it isn't what people think. Like they kind of dropped H and E and T. So it's not like shot, like it's not that obvious. Like it's quieter than that, it's subtler than that, it's softer than that. But how do you write that out in a way that is useful to the story and doesn't disrupt it? And so, as with my poetry, from the start of the first book, like you just write in what I would consider, as you say, like just a vernacular of the town, which means that you sometimes don't get quote unquote kind of standard grammar, I guess, in it. But yeah, so Stop Talking Daft is, yeah, both just that moment of introducing that voice without stereotyping it, potentially.
Yeah, like I'm thinking of something like Dickens's Hard Times, right? When the narrator's voice is one thing, and then you suddenly get the people speaking in quote marks, and you're like, oh, well, this is jarring in a very different tone.
I mean, and that's that. We have this really interesting thing with the audiobook where Joe Pitts is great. Interestingly, second name Pitts, but anyway, that's not why it's just Dix is really good. But Joe Pitts does the audiobook, and we had this really interesting conversation where the original direction he'd been given was to read the book in RP essentially, and do the voices in accent, which would have just sounded kind of mad, I think, or just would like not the point of the book. And then, so, we had really good discussions about that, but I just was like, well, no, just read it in, it's from North Yorkshire, I think, originally, Joe. And so just read it in what is his voice. And because that can be standard as well in that sense. And so that felt important as a decision, I think. But yeah, the voice of it is just the voice of the town. Like it's not, they're not speaking this other thing. There's dialect in it, I think. And it's also, I mean, it's interesting, like, this wasn't a question you asked, but I'll stop in a minute. Like the thing about language that I find really interesting is that it also shifts generationally, which again then becomes really hard to write down literally. And so the dialect or the voice that these men would have that kind of in these italicized chapters, think about like my granddad, would be much, much thicker than like my dad's, which is then much thicker than mine. And so these things also have generational shift in terms of the strength or the different inflections of accent, which also, I don't know how you would write that as dialect on a page. And so it doesn't, or how you do that in a way that wouldn't be distracting to the narrative. Not that there is really narrative in this book, but distracting to the prose.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the folding it in there in that way, rather than having that in quote marks or something, another man said, quote, as the voice is part of the narrative voice as well. I think that's what I'm trying to say, at least, and that's important to the tone of the whole novel. But then in that final sentence, and beneath their feet a mile down history, and you get those commas. Like, I've talked to Sean Hewitt recently about his commas.
Oh, don't get Sean started on his commas.
I talked to Olivia Sujic recently about exclamation marks. So I'm really interested in your commas here. Like, actually, really, they do slow us down here. And beneath their feet, comma, a mile down, comma, history. Which is what we're not expecting to have in that line. I don't think we're not expecting history. That's not the word we're expecting in that sentence, this kind of grand statement. Then waiting to be hacked into chunks and pulled out again. So this real back to tangible, physical, manual kind of language. So it's really interesting to me to go from the vernacular to a big theoretical idea, like history is beneath them, that's then transformed to the thing that they're doing, like their labour. I'm fascinated by that, like at the end of this section, so that you're kind of like, oh, I thought we were in this place, but actually we're in this quite different intellectual, emotional space.
I do love a semicolon. I just think they're quite fun. But also I think, and also I don't write with any punctuation in my poetry, so it's nice to kind of be able to run through the fields of them. I mean, it is also like, whilst also being slightly abstract, right? So beneath their feet is history. It's also just literally true, because that's kind of what coal is, right? It's kind of like crushed and condensed, like history, literal history, kind of fossils, etc. And so it is just literally true. And so, and the great kind of weird surrealism of that is also just true, therefore. And that's what I think is really interesting. So beneath their feet, like, is history in a kind of abstract sense, but also a literal sense, because that's what we're kind of mining in a very, very true sense as well. But also the kind of slightly surreal scape of people beneath our feet, literally. And, one of the things that they kind of talk about as they go through the novel is like, well, if you knew what you're walking over, you wouldn't, you got to go to the shop and you kind of got to go down with your life. You don't want to think about the people that are, the bodies that are still beneath the ground from pit explosions, anything like that you might be walking over as you go to Morrison's, that's now kind of on the site, one of the old pits in Barnsley, for example. talking to Val McDermott at one of the events I did for this book, and she was talking about how there used to be there were mines under the sea in that part of Scotland. There's even more surreal. There's kind of beneath the kind of seascape of something, these kind of mines, where some of her relatives had worked. So yes, it's both abstract but like literally true, which is kind of what I like about it. Yeah, I just kind of liked again, I guess it's back to that thing we were talking about before of applying the language of poetry, applying that lyric register to the thing that people don't assume it can be applied to is also kind of potentially what's happening, I think, in some of that.
Okay, I'll transition then us from this extract into the last questions. We talked a little bit earlier about moving from poetry to prose in your writing. One thing that we could ask on top of that is, are you always writing in the same kind of place? Are you writing in the office that I'm talking to you now in? Did you give yourself daily amounts to do when you were writing the prose as opposed to the poetry? Do you have processes, talismans, rituals?
No, I probably should. I'd be better. I did. I think when I was doing the novel, I just wanted to do a bit every day, but I didn't have like an amount. I just wrote until, I think 'cause it was in sections. I was doing like a section a day. Eventually, like once I'd found that form. But I also think just writing until I just couldn't, which was like for a couple of hours a morning, and then just like going about the rest of the day, but feeling like I'd done something. Edit in this office, I can mark in this office. I can't write here. And I often think that writers give themselves rituals in order to distract themselves from the act of writing. So I can't start this until I've got the perfect notebook. The kind of fetishization of the notebook is a kind of beautiful thing. The poem will be just as good if you write it on the back of a receipt as it will be in that kind of book. That fetishization, I think, of space, of time, of environment to write is a distraction from the actual thing itself, which can, to a certain extent, at least at first, as I say, until you need that deep time, can really be done anywhere, which is always the beauty of writing. But yeah, so do I have, not really at all. But yeah, when I was doing the novel, you had to do it every day because you'd forget what were happening. Whereas poetry doesn't kind of need that. But now I'm kind of editing this new collection of poems. So I'm sort of thinking, if I can just edit a poem a day, that will do it, I think. But yeah, if I had more rituals, it might be better.
I've heard you talk about Stephen King's book on writing before, which I think is great. Are there other books on writing that you'd recommend, or essays on quote unquote craft?
Dan Wachowski's Towards a New Poetry is really interesting. I refound that on one of my shelves before I was rereading that. I think that's really interesting to kind of think about craft. Mark Doty has written incredibly well about metaphor and imagery and kind of just and can talk about that really well, I think. And I mean, the things I used when I was first starting out were always those Paris Review interviews. So writers talking about their own writing, like that horrific John Berryman one, where they talk about that idea of, it says, I want God to give me the worst thing imaginable. I hope to be nearly crucified. In terms of like it's not, something we advise, but in terms of that practice. And those interviews I always just found fascinating of kind of finding, I'm fascinated, I think, less so in general craft and much more in how artists in general exist in the world. Like what is there, like you asked in that question before, like what is people's day-to-day process? And just what the work is of it, I think. Like, I think it's interesting, back to that question before, it's hard when you first start out or when you first get published or when you arrive in the world as a writer and you're kind of doing stuff. So little of that is the actual work. And and it's all a distraction from the actual work. There's just the work that is you and the writing. And I'm fascinated by how other writers kind of do that. Like, what is their work? Salman Rushdie talks about this thing of having he's got like a bust of Shakespeare as a knocker. So he says, I knock and I ask to be let into the world of it. And so people do have those kind of rituals. Like I don't have anything like that, but I'm interested in all those Paris Review interviews, like I say, like how it's people talking about how they've found space for it in the world and how they've built a life within it. And that seems to me the work. And that I think is what interests me more than kind of how-to guides, I think. Though they can also be really useful when you start out. I did used to have a book that was called something like How to Write a Novel and Make Loads of Money. It wasn't called that, but it was called something like that. I used to read it obsessively when I was like 15. I was like, that's what to do. I need to write a novel and make loads of money. But it had those kind of advice that are always in those kind of books, which is things like you should know everything about your cat. You should make like a file of factors for each character. You should know all this stuff about them and all those kind of exercises that you do to kind of build a hinterland of knowledge. So yeah, I used to be obsessed by that book.
Okay, 2 other questions for you. One is that given that you do teach creative writing, are there any good or easy or useful creative writing exercises that you'd recommend to listeners to do, or people maybe that aren't in creative writing workshops that they could kind of take forward?
Yeah, so 2 that I always do in workshops that I do think are really useful. So one is a really straightforward one, which is essentially an exercise in personifying abstract nouns. So you pick an emotion and you pick a place and you go, I met sadness in the library, I met happiness in the takeaway. And then you just describe that meeting as though it was literally true and think, well, what would sadness wear? How would they move? What would they speak like? What would their voice sound like? If you touch their skin, what would it feel like? What did their breath smell like? Etc., etc. And beyond just being an interesting kind of exercise in itself, what it does is give you a language to talk about abstraction, because what often turns up in kind of new writing by people is things like, he walked into the room and looked sad. He walked into the room and was anxious. It's like, well, what does that physically look like? But if you can really dig into the mannerisms or the kind of outward manifestations of that, then the writing can kind of really take off. So it's a shortcut to kind of think about that in a way. The other thing I do more and more, like in workshops, I don't tend to run as many as I used to, but when kind of I'm running workshops, I see less and less point, I guess, in everyone sitting around and going, let's all write a poem in the voice of this pen. And then everyone writes a poem in the voice of a pen and then they read it out. Because workshops really exist in order to nudge you into the thing that you wanted to write already. They're kind of pushing you through the door, but maybe the side door of what you wanted to write. And so more and more, I talk to people about this idea of something that they haven't found a way to write about yet that's been on their mind, something they've wanted to approach in writing, something that just keeps them awake at 2 a.m, and get them to put it at the bottom of their page rather than the top, and just say, write towards it. Don't write about it, write towards it, and see what happens. And so often as that process of discovery, you find that actually the thing is down a cul-de-sac halfway down, but it's kind of, it's over here somewhere. It's not the thing you thought it was. But that notion of writing towards it rather than about it frees us in some way from the kind of having to get it right somehow, I think. So they're 2 that I think are quite useful and quite fun oftentimes.
Those are great. Thank you so much. Okay, finally, what book or books do you want to recommend to us? Maybe an old book, maybe something you're reading now, maybe something not yet out.
You know, I was just reading, they sent me Richard Scott's new book, new collection of poetry. So I've just been reading the first kind of section of that, which feels like this really kind of thrilling reinvention of and kind of reinvigoration of that ekphrasis. Like he's kind of working in these still lifes, but kind of bringing it back to trauma and the self in really interesting ways. The book I read last year that I just thought was like possibly the best book I'll read this decade was It Lasts Forever and Then It's Over by Aldeburgh, this kind of Fitzcarraldo zombie novel, which really kind of sums it up. It's kind of Fitzcarraldo, and so it's philosophical and it's difficult and it's knotty, but it's a zombie novel as well. And it's kind of both those things. And if I love anything in this world, I love zombies and I love zombie novels, and I wish I got sent more. Everyone just sent me, I get sent everything published by a homosexual in this country, which is fun, and they're all stacked up behind me. But I enjoy a good zombie novel.
Amazing. Well, if there are any publicists listening looking after some like horror titles, please send them Andrew's way.
I would love it.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us. This was really enjoyable. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Please subscribe if you haven't already, leave a review and share with people you know. You can also follow the show and me on Instagram at Books Up Close and on YouTube. And if you can, please do fill out the feedback form linked in the show notes. It's really helpful to us. You can get show transcripts and more information by subscribing to the Substack. This show is made possible by an Impact Accelerator Award from the University of Hertfordshire and the Arts and Humanities Research Council.